the QMS Auditor Transition Series, Module 3, Overview of ISO 9001-2015 Changes.
Clause 4, Context of the organization. So the primary changes here that are significant is really here in 4.1, determine internal and external issues. So we want to look at what issues internally and externally are relevant to the strategic direction of the organization and the ability to achieve intended results. So what issues affect your ability to achieve intended results? Clause 4.2, interested parties. So identify the relevant interested parties and their relevant requirements. So who are the interested parties that you need to satisfy, and what are the requirements associated with those interested parties? Clause 4.3, scope. You must determine the boundaries and applicability to establish the QMS scope, considering external and internal issues, requirements of those relevant interested parties. So 4.1, 4.2 there. Products and services that are going to be within the scope of your QMS. All requirements apply if applicable. It's a little bit confusing, but basically what we're saying there is you must provide justification for claiming a requirement that's not applicable, as there's no provision for an exclusion in the new standard like there was in the 2008 version. Clause 4.4 is QMS. You must determine which processes are needed for the quality management system, including what inputs are required, what outputs are expected, making sure that your processes include those processes needed to address risk and opportunity. And you see a reference there to 6.1, which talks about planning for risk and opportunities. And that is the significant items in Clause 4 that are different or stand out in a significant way from 2008 to 2015. Clause 5, leadership. So 5.1, leadership and commitment, top management. So you still see that term, top management. There was some talk early on about getting rid of top management and just focusing on the word leadership. But you see Clause 5.1, top management must demonstrate leadership and commitment. So you see that tie-in with leadership. Top management must demonstrate leadership and commitment by taking accountability for the QMS effectiveness. So not just for the QMS, but its effectiveness. So this is where we first start to see the word accountable, accountability. There's a nice theme that I like, which is a focus on accountability and identifying who's accountable. This is where it kicks off in the standard. Top management must demonstrate leadership and commitment by the quality policy and objectives, and making sure that they're compatible with the context and strategic direction of the organization. And then also ensuring integration, which this is where we first see the word integration of the QMS requirements into the organization's business processes. So there's some other sector-specific standards that have required this integration and this connection with the QMS and business processes, and now we see it here in the base General 9001 QMS. A continuation of the last slide, top management must demonstrate leadership and commitment by promoting the use of the process approach and risk-based thinking. So to my surprise, risk-based thinking, obviously being a new term, is actually only in here once. It's in the standard one time, and that's under Clause 5.1.1. So you'll see risk in several spots, but this is where that term risk-based thinking is used. So kind of a more holistic way of looking at risk and applying risk in various approaches within the organization, such as in planning and auditing and really looking at risk and opportunity in every process of your quality management system. Top management must demonstrate leadership and commitment by engaging, directing, and supporting persons to contribute to QMS effectiveness. So engaging, not just involving, but engaging. That's where you see the tie-in there with the 7 management principles as well. And supporting other relevant management roles. So there are other leadership roles, other management roles outside of just the top management layer. And this is where we see demonstrating leadership and commitment to the QMS through supporting other relevant management roles. So again, just this little annotation, this is the location of the single requirement for the phrase risk-based thinking. Clause 5.1.2, top management must demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to customer focus. So it's that customer focus, pulling in principle number 1, ensuring that customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements are determined, which that's nothing new, but this is new and I like it, understood and consistently met. So communication does not equal understanding, and that's something that I really like about the standard is this word understood is brought in, and consistently met versus just meeting, but on an ongoing basis that you're meeting the ever-changing customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Also, demonstrating leadership and commitment to customer focus by ensuring that risk and opportunities are determined and addressed. Focusing on enhancing customer satisfaction, and that focus is maintained. So again, an ongoing, kind of like consistently met, customer satisfaction is maintained. You can't just make them happy once and be done. It's got to be maintained. So 5.2 policy, this is where there's an explicit requirement for the quality policy to be communicated, understood, which is great, and applied. So it's going to be really interesting to see how do auditors interpret this? How are they going to look at whether or not you're applying the quality policy? And that's something that that I ask in my audits once folks are done giving their spiel of the quality policy they memorize. My question to them is, okay, show me how you apply that, or show me how you demonstrate or you execute that quality policy. You know, what role do you play in that quality policy? So I like that change. Clause 5.3, organizational roles, responsibility, and authorities. There's an explicit requirement for relevant roles to be assigned, communicated, and again we see this word understood, which is great. So handing someone a job description or going over during orientation what you expect of them in terms of their roles, responsibilities, and authorities is probably not good enough, but you have to ensure that you've not only, again, communicated, but there's understanding there in relevant roles, what is expected of him or her. And there's something here that is removed explicit requirement for a management representative. Now the responsibility resides with top management to assign responsibility and authority. So that doesn't mean if you have a management representative that they no longer have a job. It just means that, again, that single point management representative assignment is not required. My recommendation is to, maintain a technical point of contact, a technical guru or expert, but then make sure that the responsibility is disseminated amongst the top management role and those folks that are clearly process owners. 5.3 also goes on to say, ensure processes are delivering their intended outputs. So all of your processes of your QMS that are within your scope, you need to make sure that you're delivering their intended outputs. So one question might be, how do you know what the intended outputs are? Where is that defined within your organization? And in fact, that becomes something that you have to define. You should have a process for, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the process design module. Clause 6, planning. 6.1, actions to address risk and opportunities. So in accordance with 4.1 and 4.2, the quality management system planning must determine risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. It doesn't say risk and opportunities that need to go away or that need to be weeded out completely. There are certain inherent risks associated with anything that you do. So just ensuring that they're addressed and that they're addressed appropriately, that's going to vary from one circumstance to the next, certainly one organization to the next. 6.1 also stating enhance desirable effects. That seems to be a little bit of an interesting word to use, desirable effect, but the idea is enhancing the ability in your planning to achieve those desired results, those desired outputs. Prevent or reduce undesired effects. So you see this new usage of desirable effects and undesirable effects being brought up in 6.1. 6.2, objectives and planning. So objectives should be established for processes that are relevant to the quality management system. So all of the QMS processes that you've identified in your scope back in clause 4, there should be objectives for each of those. Objectives should be monitored, communicated, and updated. And here's where I think the standard really kind of dropped the ball with respect to the use of the term understood. Understood should be added here. So if you're supposed to understand your job function and your role and your responsibility, and you're supposed to understand the quality policy and that sort of thing, it doesn't make any sense to me why you shouldn't be required to understand the objectives that are associated with the QMS processes that are relevant to your job. I think that maybe it's an oversight. I'm not exactly sure why that term is not there, but in my opinion, it should be, and it's a big miss. And actually, I put it here: missed opportunity to ensure objectives are understood. Again, on 6.2, planning how to achieve quality objectives. So it's how, not just achieving them, but how do you achieve quality objectives? And you must include what will be done, what resources are needed, which I think is great. You can have all the plans and objectives in the world, but if you don't discuss the resources that are needed in order to achieve those objectives, then again, I think you're missing a key point. So I'm glad to see that this is here. And you'll see this in a couple of areas in the standard. The whole planning and need to identify resources is really bulked up, and I like that. Who will be responsible as it relates to quality objectives? When will it be completed? So there's a time frame applied to quality objectives, where in the 2008 version it just seemed like, well, if your quality objective is to lose 25 pounds, then the only thing you had to say is, well, I never said by when. I didn't say it was 25 pounds by the end of the year. I just said 25 pounds. So I'm glad to see when will it be completed being added there. And how will results be evaluated? Will results be evaluated on a scoreboard once a month, in management review? So I really like some of the items that have been bulked up in 6.2, although I think the word understood being left out of 6.2 is definitely a scar. 6.3, changes to the QMS should be carried out in a planned manner. So this is planning of changes. This is not changes as it relates to product changes per se, but this is a more holistic view of changes. So changes to the QMS should be carried out in a planned manner, considering availability of resources. So you may have resources, but maybe those resources are tied up working on another project. Allocation or reallocation of responsibilities and authorities. So when you make a change, before you make that change, let's consider the planning that needs to kind of rotate around the allocation or reallocation of existing responsibilities and authorities. What changes there? And there are various clauses where change is addressed. So here we see changes addressed in QMS and its processes for 4.1, 5.3E, and 6.3. Documented information, so what is going to change when you change your documentation, a work instruction, a step in a procedure. Organizational knowledge, so how has the organizational knowledge changed, what changes, what needs in terms of knowledge change when a change takes effect. For example, you may have an obsolete product that you don't need knowledge of anymore, or a new product or new service that you need to bulk up your organizational knowledge of. 8.1, operational planning and control. Requirements for products and services, 8.2.1b and 8.2.4. Design and development changes, 8.3.6. Production and service provision, 8.5.6. Internal audit, this is 9.2.2a. So what changes are connected, or when something changes in your management system, how does that affect internal auditing? Same thing for management review, 9.3.2b, 9.3.3b, and nonconformity and corrective action, 10.2.1f. So we pulled together a little bit of a checklist there so that you can see all of the touch points in the standard where there are clauses that connect to this change management, planning of changes aspect of the management system. So changes and risks sprinkled all throughout the standard. Clause 7, support. Clause 7.1, resources. So determine and provide adequate resources to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the quality management system. So again, I like adequate resources, but it's very ambiguous. What does that mean? And you as an organization, you have to determine that, or your customer, you and interested parties come together to define what adequate resources are. And resource considerations now include capabilities, which was there, and constraints of internal resources. So maybe there's a technical knowledge constraint. You know how to manufacture or conduct service on one particular product line, but not another, and you need external resources, or your internal resources need additional training, that sort of thing. Needs from external providers. So you need to consider what needs do you have where you need to rely on external providers. What resource considerations where you're going to have persons needed, infrastructure needed, infrastructure being machine and or equipment, communication. So these are some things that need to be considered in your planning, establishing, implementing, maintaining, and improvement of your resource needs. To go on further, a continuation here in clause 7.1, environment for the operation of processes. So this is something that's rather significant and kind of goes back to that illustration where foosball and LGBT and some of these other, the Wordle that was put up there, some of these other kind of more soft and new age type terms are being used, and this is where the overlap is. So the environment for the operation of processes. such as human and physical factors. So, for example, social. And this piece is in a note. So it's, again, giving guidance, but not a steadfast requirement. But social, non-discriminatory, or calm. If there are social factors that have an effect on your desired result or your outputs of your processes, then certainly that needs to be something that is considered. Psychological, so stress reducing, burnout prevention, emotionally protective. Physical, such as temperature, heat, humidity, light, airflow, hygiene, noise. So I thought this was kind of funny when I first saw it, as hygiene. So, I guess I've been in certain facilities where there were definitely people and infrastructure where hygiene was an issue, and it limited the ability for folks to actually get the job done. So it's nice to see that instead of just work environment and production environment, that operation of processes and the environment that's necessary for the successful operation of those processes is now really broadened and brings on some human and physical factors. So resource considerations continued. Monitoring and measuring resources. So monitoring and measuring, this is where there's a change from monitoring and measurement equipment to resources. Those resources must be suitable and maintained. You have to retain record of evidence of fitness for purpose. That's a new word there, fitness for purpose. Organizational knowledge. So resource considerations of organizational knowledge. So what kind of knowledge does the organization need? And I kind of think of when I see this term organizational knowledge, I think about a big brain hovering over a physical building above an organization. But what organizational knowledge is required to ensure the operation of the processes of the QMS, achieve conformity of products and services, and how do you maintain that organizational knowledge? And how is that knowledge made available as necessary to those individuals within the organization that need access to that knowledge? So clause 7.2, competency. This is competency equals person or persons doing work that is under the organization's control, so it doesn't have to be an employee. It's affecting performance, affecting the effectiveness of the quality management system. Okay, so that kind of lays the scope of what we're talking about in terms of competency. So it's those three items there. Anybody that is under the organization's control, affecting performance, affecting the overall kind of performance or effectiveness of the QMS, those folks need to be competent based on education, training, or experience. So this word "or" is in there, meaning that you could hire someone that is completely experienced and that individual is more than competent to do the job, or hire someone at a certain education level. But the word skills is removed from this version in 2015. So it used to say education, training, skills, and experience, and now it says or experience, and the word skills is out. 7.3, this is awareness. So persons doing work, again, under the organization's control, are aware of the quality policy, relevant quality objectives. And again, it's like they took the word understood and said no to it twice. And I don't like this, but you have to just be aware of relevant objectives, only aware, no requirement for understood. You have to be aware of your contribution to the QMS. You have to be aware of benefits of improved performance. So when the organization is improving its performance, what are the benefits? And that might be a personal benefit. You might get a bonus or some other payout structure or what have you, but benefits hopefully to the customer, benefits to other interested parties. The implications of not conforming. And this doesn't mean that you get written up and you've got to go to the HR manager's office, but this is what are the implications, what are the results if you do not conform, or if a process is non-conforming or a product is non-conforming, and subsequent processes, people, or steps, what is the impact? What's the implication? How severe, and what is the result of not conforming? Again, it does not say non-conforming product. It says not conforming, so it's more holistic and all-encompassing there. 7.4, communication. Communication must be determined, again, both internally and externally. So what will be communicated, when to communicate, with whom to communicate, how to communicate, and who communicates. So this is similar to what we've seen in ISO 14001, where they have had a requirement there in that standard for a while, that you very, very clearly state who, what, when, where, why, how, that sort of thing, as it relates to communication both internally and especially externally. So that is something that is broadened and is new and shows better alignment between the QMS and the EMS. 7.5, so this is our old clause 4.3, clause 4.4 kind of smashed in together. QMS shall include documented information required by the standard. And there's a little note here for me that says only 3 explicitly stated, which is true, and that is the scope of the QMS, which is clause 4.3, the quality policy, which is 522, and quality objectives. So basically the standard's saying outside of those 3 required maintained documents, that's really all you have to have, unless you determine that there's a need for other documents to be created, or your customer requires you, or some other interested party requires you to have additional documentation. But those are the big 3: scope, policy, and objectives in terms of explicitly stated traditional documented procedures or traditional documents. There's no requirement at all there for a quality manual. So if you have this big honking 3-ring binder quality manual that's filled with dust and no one ever looks at it, this might be your opportunity to throw that out. Congratulations. And there are some enhancements for creating and updating documented information. So, for example, title, date, author, reference number, language, software version, graphics. So really making updates, creating and updating documentation, making sure that your documentation is adequately protected. For example, loss of confidentiality, improper use, or loss of integrity. And this is for what we've called in the past not only procedures and whatnot, but also records. So loss of confidentiality due to a formula, improper use, that sort of thing. So adequately protected. And records protected from unintended alterations. So we see a bit of this in aerospace, and then some in automotive as well, with regard to integrity of information and fraud and that sort of thing. So records being protected to make sure that folks don't, after the fact, go and alter that particular record, or even alter documentation that might be used for a formula or what have you. So that concludes the plan portion of the standard, clause 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now we move on to the do section, which is clause 8, operation. Clause 8 is rather expansive. We've got operational planning and control, requirements for products and services, design and development of products and services, control of externally provided processes, products and services, which used to be purchasing, production and service provision, and release of products and services. Finally, we have control of non-conforming product as well. 8.1, so under the operations piece, we have general and broad requirements for operational planning and control that goes beyond the product and or services criteria. So controls that go beyond the product or service specs. Specifically B81B, there are explicit requirements to establish criteria for QMS processes. So those QMS processes that you've identified in your scope or in 4.4, you need to establish criteria that's needed for products and services in addition to the traditional specs. So what that's saying is criteria for your QMS processes. Okay, so each of those, not just the value added or core processes, but each of those QMS processes. E, so documented information to the extent necessary. So again, that's very, very vague. That's left up to you and other interested parties. But the caveat is the extent necessary to have confidence that processes have been carried out as planned. So it doesn't say that products and or services are of a quality nature, but that the processes within your QMS have been carried out as planned, and typically that would be validated through meeting criteria that you've set up for those processes. So 8.2, which is requirements for products and services, we see at 8.2.1, explicit requirements for communicating with the customer that include establishing specific requirements for contingency action. So when there's something that goes wrong, what are the contingency actions there? It doesn't necessarily say contingency plan, like a longer contingency plan requirement that we see in the automotive QMS, but contingency actions, and that is a new term. So the ability to meet the defined requirements in 2008 now states 822B can meet the claims for the products and or services it offers. So if you have a specific claim that the product does something spectacular, or your services of a certain quality nature, you can meet those claims. So whatever you're claiming in terms of meeting the requirements, it used to say ability to meet the defined requirements, but can you meet the claims? I think that one is going to be a little strange to audit as well, and it'd be interesting to see some nonconformities there that vary from auditor to auditor to see, how do you substantiate that finding? So we shall see. So to move on with 8.2, review shall be conducted prior to the organization's commitment to supply a product. So that key phrase prior to in the 2008 version now states at 8231 that the organization shall conduct a review before committing to supply products and services to the customer. So the keywords going prior to now changing to before committing to. That's the difference there in the new standard in that section. Clause 8.3, so we start getting into design and development. The requirements are in this section are rearranged a bit, and I really like the new layout here. So 8.3.2 is planning. So it's more of a process-based approach. So 8.3.2 is planning, followed by inputs, controls, outputs, and then changes. And one of the things that I use as a memory jogger here is Peacock. So PICOC, planning, input, controls, outputs, and changes. I like this. I like the layout. It seems more process friendly and certainly at least makes sense to me. So to continue with this design and development planning, which is the first P there, has been expanded to consider internal and external resources needed and interfaces between persons involved. So what internal and external resources do you need? Maybe you need external resources with regard to technical expertise or some subject matter expert or a special process, and then interfaces between persons. Involvement of customers and users. So this is something that's also very new, which is involving your customers and perhaps even the end users of your product or services up front in the design and development planning side. 833, design and development inputs includes standards or codes of practice that the organization is committed to implementing. So this is an input of code of practice. So this might be just an industry standard. It might be what is normal practice in your particular line of business. These need to be inputs into the design and the development process. Continuing with 8.3, we have 834, which is combining the requirements of design and development verification and validation. They used to be split up in the 2008 standard, and now they're kind of pulled together under one umbrella called controls. So verification needs to ensure that outputs meet input requirements, and validation ensures specified application or intended use requirements are met. So nothing real new there, other than they're under that umbrella of controls, and the verbiage is expanded just a bit. So there's also this in the 2008 version, a comma after met in the phrase where known. So that has actually been removed. I think that's a good thing. So this reads, validation ensures specified application or intended use requirements are met, period. So it's really your responsibility as an organization to understand what the application and the intended use of your product or your services would be in the eyes of the customer. So where known, that means with that being taken out, that means you have to go and find out how your products or services are going to be used, basically, which I think that's a good change to that particular portion of the standard, specifically because it's in the design phase, and that's a good time to get through some of those ambiguities and get a good understanding of what the intended use is of the product or service that you're passing along to the customer. So 835, this is design development outputs, must be adequate for the subsequent processes. So that's a new phrase as well. So adequate for the subsequent processes. This might be the next station in line within your organization. This might be passing out to an outsourced handler or service provider, or somebody that's going to paint your part and bring it back in, whatever. But the idea there is making your outputs very clear as your output is their input. So I like that particular change. 8.3.6, design and development changes must include a record showing C, the authorization of changes. So who is authorized to approve the change? I like that. I like, you'll see again, authority, authorize, that nomenclature used throughout the standard, and I like that. It brings some accountability. So that's design development. 8.4, This is what we used to call purchasing. So providing terminology, and there's a broadened scope here. So outsourcing equals externally provided processes, products, and or services. Okay, and supplier now is external provider. There's a small paragraph in 4.1 in the 2008 version, and now that's that particular very small citing has been moved to where I believe is best suited, which is 8.4, and a bit more expansion to what we mean by external provider or external resource or externally provided. So 8.4.2, type and extent of control of external providers. We need to not control everyone the same, and there's some external providers that you have to control a lot more than others. So how do you make that determination? So 8.4.2c, take into consideration, one, the potential impact of not complying, your external provider not complying with what the requirements are, and then what are the effectiveness, or what is the effectiveness of controls applied by the external provider. So if they're frequently producing non-complying outputs, are their controls effective at containing those nonconformities so that they don't eventually make their way to you? So I think that's also a great expansion here. Potential impact, being proactive, and then when something goes wrong, how effective are they at containing their own nonconformities, kind of that detection piece in the FMEA. For those of you in automotive or those of you that use an FMEA. 8.5, production and service provision. So this is really where the rubber meets the road. This is where really the only clause where there is added value. Everything else, all other 27 of the 28 subclauses really provide no direct value to the customer. All of that is, I guess you could call it waste or a factor of doing business, but this is where we start to get to the money-making side of things. So 8.5.1, the provision now combines and broadens several clauses. So controlled conditions, basically we're talking about production or service being executed with controlled conditions, and those things that have been added here are suitable monitoring and measuring resources. This previously was 7.6. This section kind of confuses me a little bit because you don't get much in the way of calibration at all in the 2015 standard, and that really concerns me. I feel like it's we're taking a step back and loosening controls where we probably shouldn't on the manufacturing side or the product creation side, simply in order to be inclusive to the service side. So I'm a little bit concerned, and I can tell you on the IATF 16949 automotive QMS, they put some of these controls back in, which is a good thing. But the baseline 9001-2015 here, suitable monitoring and measuring resources. Again, it's not equipment, it's not machines necessarily. It could be equipment and machines, but it could also be human resources making kind of a go, no-go, pass-fail decision. But in any case, you need to make sure that those resources are suitable, be it anything from a colorblind tests to hearing, these are pass-fail type resources, as the standard is calling it now, that certainly do have an impact on whether or not you send a bad part to the next station. So, but I think it's just too broad. 7.6 calibration is completely gone at this point. D is suitable infrastructure, meaning facilities, equipment, etc., and an environment for the operation of processes. So previously this was work environment. So this is a bit more expanded again, I think, due to the inclusion more so with the service provision now, the operation of processes of any sort, be it production or service. Controlled conditions shall also include the appointment of competent persons. So whatever the competency requirements are, you're running at controlled conditions, you got to have competent folks to work within your operations. And then G, implement actions to prevent human error. So human error has never been in these standards, and here we see preventing human error. It's great that there's acknowledgement that that is a key contributor to success or failure. So the idea is, how do you minimize or weed out human error where at all possible? I think that's a good addition as well. 852, identify and traceability. So identify status of outputs. So this used to say product status, and the idea here now is identifying the status of an order, identifying the status of a project that's being reviewed as it goes through, let's say, a development phase. So status of output certainly opens the scope much wider than it did before. What's going to be interesting is evaluating and coming up with tangible output status identifiers that would be for, let's say, support processes like IT or HR or maintenance. So how do you go about as an organization looking at identification of the status of outputs? Let's say a machine that's not quite ready for production because it's down being handled some sort of preventive maintenance or what have you. So but I like this being expanded because it does include other process outputs, not just product. The next item is unique identification of outputs. So expanding from identification of products in a similar way as the status of outputs and identification of outputs being very clear. So I like those two new expanded requirements. 853, property belonging to the customer. So this is where we saw a little bit of customer-owned property in the 2008 version. Now it's saying belonging to customers or external providers. So you may have some property that belongs to a supplier of yours, or it might belong to contract labor. So how do you keep track of that property and control it and bring it into this definition of controlled conditions? Note, this includes materials, components, tools and equipment, premises, intellectual property, and personal data. So in 2008, we saw a note showing intellectual property and personal data, but materials, components, tools and equipment, and premises have been added to this note. At 854, preservation of outputs. Again, outputs to include service and other process outputs, not just products. So what do you do in terms of preservation of all of your outputs as it relates to non-product aspects of your operations? So this also includes a note, includes contamination control, transmission, or transportation, and those items are new to the note in the preservation piece. 855, post-delivery activities now contains its own clause. This used to be kind of tucked into another clause, and post-delivery activity now should consider potential undesirable consequences once the product or service has been delivered. What could go wrong, what could happen. C, nature, use, and intended lifetime of products. So a part of your control of your operations is considering and understanding the nature, the use, and how long the product should be used. So this includes warranty, contractual obligations such as maintenance services, supplemental services, i.e. Recycling or final disposal. So these are all seen as not traditional service add-ons or additional services that the customer pays for, but this is once the product or service is delivered and it's done, the sales cycle is over. How do you ensure that these additional activities are considered in your operational controls? 856, control of changes now contains a clause in production and service provision, so it's broken out on its own. Previously, we only really saw control of changes in the design and development side, when in fact we all know that there's quite a bit of changes in controls that happen in live production or live service. So this gives a little bit more detail on controlling those changes in the operational lane that happen outside of design and development. So for those changes that are happening inside operations, maybe changes on the fly, there need to be records that must include results of the review of changes, person or persons authorizing the change. So again, we see that use of that term authorizing, and action arising from review. So once a change review has been done, what actions take place, and that needs to be on the record. So Clause 8.6, release of products and services. So this states that release outside of planned arrangements are only allowed by, again, here's this authority, relevant authority, and as applicable by the customer. So that needs to be determined up front. What changes can you make? What types of products that deviate from the original plan can be released or proceed in the cycle of events in producing the part. What things can be changed without the customer approval, when what needs the customer approval. But in any case, this has a relevant authority. So who can and cannot release when you're outside of the plans. There needs to be a record. It must show traceability to the person or persons authorizing the release. Again, I like that. Too often it's, oh, Joe said that I can release this, but there's no record that Joe says that you can or cannot release something under deviation. But now that's a requirement as a part of the record for release of the product, and just maintaining that traceability. I think that's a good thing. Now we move on to Clause 8.7, which is expanded from control a non-conforming product, or back in the day it was control a non-conforming material. Now it's at 871, control a non-conforming output. So it's expanded again from product. 872 says a record must identify authority deciding the action in respect to the nonconformity. So once again, we see authority here, and who decided what the action was, and that person, that individual, needs to be a part of that nonconforming output record. So now we move over to Clause 9, performance evaluation, which is where we get into some of the check processes. Clause 9.1, monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. The organization must determine for itself what needs to be monitored or measured the methods used to ensure valid results, when the monitoring and measurement must be performed, when results have to be analyzed and evaluated. So real quick, just jumping back up to there. So this is another example, and we've seen this a couple times throughout the 2015 upgrade, where you've got kind of the why, what, when, how type spiel in a clause. This is very similar, almost like the communication piece. Who can communicate? How, when, why. This is saying, you have to determine yourself, and when or how often does something need to be monitored or measured. On the automotive side, these particular requirements here are typically spelled out in what's called a control plan. But what needs to be monitored, how often, what methods are to be used, and when do we analyze and evaluate those results. So you'll see a tie-in here on the IATF 16949 side of things with control plans. Continued customer satisfaction, so monitoring of customer perception. That word perception stays in the standard, but it says can include. I think that's interesting. The can include is a little bit broader. It doesn't say must include, but can include customer surveys, customer feedback, meetings with the customer. I think it's always good to do a trip report so that folks within your organization can get up-to-date voice of the customer information. Market share analysis, compliments. Hey, it shouldn't all be negative. So positive perception is perception too. You want to take things gone right as well as things gone wrong back and share it with your team. And of course, warranty claims. And if you have dealers, dealer reports. So these are all sources of customer perception that should be monitored, measured, analyzed when possible as a good input into how satisfied the customer is. Analysis and evaluation of both data and information arising from monitoring and measurement. So this is a little bit new, just saying and information. So not just looking at and evaluating data, but evaluating information, reports, and information can be, in a variety of different forms, but it's just a broader sense of, trying to get a good understanding of when are you doing well and when may you be falling short. So analysis results must be used to evaluate, at a minimum, products and services. So it doesn't say products or services here, it says and services. Degree of customer satisfaction, so not just is the customer satisfied, but to what degree. And I think those are good additions to continue the analysis of the performance of the quality management system. So how is your QMS performing overall? And usually this would be an aggregate of all of the criteria of various QMS processes. If planning has been implemented effectively, again, this is kind of things gone right versus things gone wrong. Where have you done well in terms of overall planning, and where have you not done so well? Effectiveness of actions to address risk and opportunities. So not just evaluating actions just on the basis of, well, we've had 20 actions that have been open. No, we're not talking about quantity here, we're talking about quality. How effective have your actions been, and specifically to address risk and cash in on opportunities where they are found. 9.2, we're getting into internal auditing. So not a lot has changed here on the 9001 side, but on the IATF 16949 side, there are a ton of changes here. There is a statement here basically removing that sentence saying auditors shall not audit their own work. That is gone. They can audit their own work, they just have to be impartial, and that word impartial was there before and it's still there now. 9.3, management review, a handful of changes here. We ensure that the QMS aligns with the strategic direction, and management review input shall be planned and carried out taking into consideration. I don't like this where it says taking into consideration. Does that mean, well, you have to consider, or you have to look at the following items? I don't know. This is going to be definitely a point of confusion, but my recommendation is take all of these remaining bullet points, put them on a management review agenda and review these things because they just make sense. So relevant external and internal issues. What issues are relevant, and let's discuss them during management review. Information, including trends in quality objectives, nonconformities, and performance of external providers. So these items have been there in terms of requirements as inputs into management review, but now you see this word trends. So we want to look at trends across those three items there: objectives, nonconformities, and basically supplier performance. To continue, the adequacy of resources, previously only, and this was only an output. So the idea before the change here was you asked yourself, how adequate are our resources after the management review meetings or what have you are over. Now there's a kind of a pause point here within management review to ask yourselves while you're sitting around the table, do we have adequate resources in order to fulfill the goals and objectives that we have for our company and for our processes? Another change that I really like is effectiveness of actions regarding risk and opportunity. So again, not just saying how many actions do we have or how many corrective actions versus preventive actions do we have open, but this is how effective have our actions been regarding getting ahead of potential nonconformities and taking action on seizing opportunities that surface. Management review outputs includes decision and actions related to need for change. So that's another phrase that was not in there before, need for change. That concludes the check process from clause 9. Now let's jump into the final clause, which is where our act phase comes in, and this is improvement. Clause 10, improvement. So this is a new clause in addition to 10.3, continual improvement. We have this overarching improvement clause. So determine and select opportunities for improvement to address future needs and expectations. So you're forward thinking here, future needs and expectations, reducing undesired effects. So how do we go about reducing things that are bad that we don't want in our processes, our business, and improve performance? For example, breakthrough change, innovation, or reorganization. So these are all elements of this new clause, standalone 10.1, now called improvement. Nonconformity is all-encompassing in 10.2. We're not talking about nonconformity for just product, but it's across the board, anything where you have a undesired situation or unexpected output, that would be a nonconformity. And the organization must react to the nonconformity, take action to control and correct it. So this is usually containment and quick short-term fix. Deal with the consequences. This is kind of interesting. Deal with the consequences. That's so broad. I'm not exactly sure, why they use that verbiage, but whatever the consequences to the nonconformity are, you have to deal with them, of course. To continue, we have to act to eliminate the cause or causes so it does not recur or occur elsewhere, which I like that, or occur elsewhere. That's something that in the TS 6949 standard was referred to as the corrective action impact. So the idea is, let's contain, eliminate the causes, and then make sure that it doesn't occur in other places by reviewing and analyzing the nonconformity, determining if similar nonconformities could exist or could potentially occur. So you're really going after containment and ensuring that whatever you found as a nonconformity isn't going to surface in other products, services, or areas. And then you want to update risk and opportunities, for example, to your SWOT analysis ranking or your FMEA ranking once a nonconformity or a suspected nonconformity or change has occurred that might make sense to update those documents. 10.3, you must continually improve the quality management system to make sure that it is suitable, adequate, and effective. So this is kind of in alignment with the EMS standard 14001. SAE is the abbreviation there. So is the QMS suitable? Is it adequate? Is it effective? And you must consider the following: results of analysis and evaluation, outputs from management review, and again, here's a little note similar to EMS standard ISO 14001 requirement. So the idea here is, as a part of continual improvement, to look at suitability, adequacy, effectiveness, and results of analysis and evaluation, and those outputs from management review, to see if you're improving continually in the way that you intend. Again, we have at the tail end here Annex A, and this is informative clarification of the new structure, terminology, and concepts. So we've got structure and terminology, products and services, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, risk-based thinking, applicability, documented information, organizational knowledge, control of external provided processes, products, and services. So that informative section gives you more detail on what the intent of the requirements are as they relate to those 8 concepts or new items there in the 2015 standard. Annex B, you can see all of these other documents that TC 176 is involved in, which TC is the technical committee, 176 is the technical committee number assigned to the folks that are writing the 9001 series and some of these other standards. And then the final section is the bibliography and the citations. So another tool that is cited in table A1 in the back of the standard points to this correlation matrix. Now, what the correlation matrix does is it gives a one-to-one comparison of the 9001 2015 clauses and where you can find those clauses in the 2008 version. Now, on the flip side, the correlation matrix also goes in the other direction, which is the 2008 clauses and how they align with the 2015 clauses. Personally, I like the latter version the best because I am still very, very ingrained with regard to the old clause structure and where all the numbering is, and I'm still figuring my way out through the 2015 layout. If you're interested in getting your hands on this correlation matrix, you can go to our website and simply type in correlation matrix and this document will pop up. It's certainly a good companion tool to have alongside your standard. So let's review some pros. So the standard's flexible. It includes a lot of new requirements for service organization. It's very focused on risk and integration of various systems, and certainly that connection to the business strategy is a good thing. And accountability, we see this sprinkled throughout. I think that's great. Some cons, however, generic equals confusion. So I think you're going to see quite a bit of confusion probably on both the auditor side and as well as the companies that are implementing this. And then this thing called context of the organization, context of the is what I like to call it. It's just way more confusing than it needs to be. And basically clause 4, in my opinion, could use a rewrite. It's not in chronological order, and it's just way too confusing. No one uses context of the organization in day-to-day talk, so it's a little confusing. The other con, where are the records? So we used to be able to point to this little flag called C 4.2.4 in parentheses, and whenever we saw those words together, we knew that there was a requirement for a record, but we don't have that anymore. What we have is this word retained, and so anytime there's retained, you got to go searching for retained documented information, and I just don't like that. Who will be the leader? So if there isn't a management representative, then who's going to be the leader? So I think it has pros and cons, but is a bit of a con. Auditor interpretation, I think, is going to be widespread, and to me that's a con. So again, context of the organization. This is just my little cheat sheet for you to hopefully clarify this point. So who are you? What issues are relevant? Who are the interested parties, and what are their requirements? What processes are needed? What processes are internal versus external? What are risks and what are the opportunities with regard to the context of your organization? All of the pieces of your organization, what are they? What are the risks? What are internal versus external? So hopefully this slide will help you in being a bit more clear on what the standard's requiring there. Again, documentation, it's confusing at best. You've got information, documented information, maintaining documented information, and retaining documented information. It just doesn't need to be that vague and confusing. So for that, I give this a big thumbs down. You know, what happened to the good old days of C 4.2.4? Follow the leader. Well, who is the leader now? A management representative is no longer a single member of management, so who's going to be the driver? And will the driver or drivers know the requirements? My hope is that the process owners will step up and learn the requirements, learn their role in deploying, implementing, maintaining, and improving the quality management system. But we shall see. This one is to be determined. I am a little bit concerned, but my hope is that organizations do just that. They disseminate responsibility throughout the top management and process ownership level, as I've hoped had been done for a while now. So another issue to consider is auditor interpretation. One question that has come up a handful of times during our webinars is this question: with so many general or generic requirements, how will this affect audit findings? The answer is that variance in audit conclusions may prove to be a concern. After all, focus will be or should be placed on the effects or the outputs of processes as compared to their intended effect, as well as the impact on interested parties. So those are some things that should be considered in the auditor's interpretation of whether or not you're complying with the standard or not, whether your processes are effective or not. We shall see how much variance we have from one auditor to the next, but the idea is to have a very clear understanding of what your desired outputs are for each of your processes, the ambiguous requirements within the standard, sit down with your team and really define how you're going to go about satisfying those requirements, just to take that ambiguity out of the equation. So, training recommendations. What are our training recommendations as it relates to the updates to the standard? Audit program managers, without a doubt, need to be updated and trained on what are the significant changes to the standard, specifically impacting not only the auditing program, but also all of the processes within the quality management system. Lead auditors as well. It's very difficult to go out and lead an audit team to conduct audits if you yourself are not familiar with what the standard changes are. Also, internal auditors, anybody that's going to be going out conducting audits on that audit team, need to be trained at least on the significant differences between the 2008 and the 2015 version of the standard. And process owners. This becomes more relevant in IATF 16949, again, as process owners is now called out as a specific duty, so to speak, related to the execution of the processes. So the process owners need to understand what are the relevant portions of the standard that apply to their function, their process that they have to manage, and how have those requirements changed from the old version to the new version. And leadership awareness, just overall awareness that your top level leadership and leadership throughout, even frontline leadership, needs to be in tune with related to standard changes. And then finally, all employee awareness. So our recommendation is to spend at least an hour or two per year minimum to update the folks in all levels, all functions of the organization on standard requirements, what they should expect during audits, just a good touch point to make sure that everybody is in tune with standard changes, process changes, that sort of thing. And, typically that's something that needs to be maintained on an ongoing basis, not just employee awareness, say during orientation, but something that on an ongoing basis needs to be revisited. So in summary, the best results are achieved through a systematic approach. These changes to the system, updates, transitioning to new standards, etc., must be management driven. So buy-in has to be through a management driven initiative and approach versus from the bottom upward. Needs change. So your needs of interested parties change on an ongoing basis. You need to stay focused on the customer. I would recommend, again, on an ongoing basis, annually at a minimum, sitting down, pulling out your customer specific requirements, specifically those that are in writing, and ensure that those customer requirements are still maintainable, that they're still feasible for you to achieve those customer requirements. Annex SL, again, provides the new high-level structure that may create growing pains. So in summary, again, I would recommend don't base your documentation structure or policies and procedures around the documentation in Annex SL or in other standards, because that numbering scheme may change. But you do need to be familiar with that new layout, 10-clause structure, and this might be a good opportunity now to move more towards numbering your documentation in alignment with your own internal process structure, if that's something that is causing you growing pains from one release change to the next. So a couple of summary items there. And finally, 9001-2015 is based on the 7 quality management principles. They used to be the 8, now they're the 7, and several significant changes there and overall principles that we've reviewed. There are several new key terms and definitions. Be familiar with key dates by working with your registrar and with your customers. And finally, we ended with various pros and cons associated with the changes. So talk about those pros and cons. Talk about the variance that may be expected from one auditor to the next with your registrar. You ask them what are their interpretations of some of these changes and what they expect to see prior to them arriving to do your transition audit.
This concludes Module 3, Part 2 of the QMS Auditor Transition Series.